What if the color of your eyes could be traced back to a single mistake in nature, one tiny typo in human DNA, 10,000 years ago, that quietly rewrote the way millions of people would one day see the world? Imagine discovering that all the blue eyes you have ever known might lead back to one unknown child on a windswept ancient plain whose story was never meant to be remembered. In this video, you'll step inside the mind of a disgraced scientist, Dr. Aris Thorn, a man buried in a basement lab with nothing left but his obsession and a 7,000-year-old skull fragment from northern Spain. You'll see how a single bone, labeled and forgotten as CS-117, becomes his window into the past, and how he risks his entire career to chase a color that no one believes you can find in ancient bone. You'll discover how he uses cutting-edge DNA sequencing and a modified bioinformatics simulator to hunt down an elusive mutation in the OCA2 gene, a tiny nucleotide change he names Marker X that whispers of reduced melanin and the possibility of the first blue iris, and you'll watch as that microscopic error transforms into an emotional, time-bending journey from a lone Mesolithic hunter near the Black Sea to a chain of descendants stretching into our present day, tying CEOs, fishermen, and teachers together through a fragile, invisible genetic thread. If you enjoy deep cinematic stories that mix science, mystery, and human emotion, make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter of this world of hidden histories written in our DNA. The bone fragment did not look like much. A palm-sized curve of ancient cranium, the color of weak tea, resting on a bed of sterile black foam under the relentless white light of Darker Iris. Thorn's laboratory. To anyone else it was a catalogue number. CS-117, a 7,000-year-old parietal bone from a Mesolithic dig site in northern Spain, notable only for its completeness. To Aris it was a window, and he was straining to see through the murk of millennia. His fingers, sheathed in nitrile gloves, hovered above it, not daring to touch. The orbital rim was partially intact, a subtle arc that had once cradled an eye. This was the locus of his obsession. Colleagues at the Institute for Anthropological Genetics had dismissed his initial notes about pigmentation as speculative fantasy. "You can't get color from structure, Aris," the department chair, Dr. Vance, had sighed during his last review. "The sound like a door closing, especially not from a fragment. Sequence the collagen if you must, but this pigment pursuit is a dead end." But Aris saw what they refused to consider. The morphology of the supraorbital foramen, the delicate channels that once carried nerves and blood vessels to the eye, suggested adaptations. His measurements, cross-referenced with a database of thousands of skulls, hinted at a physiology tuned for lower light conditions, a possible correlate to reduced ocular melanin. He was not looking for color itself, he was hunting for its ghost, its structural echo in bone. The lab was silent, save for the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant lonely sigh of the building's ventilation. It was well past midnight, the hour when ambition curdles into compulsion. The rest of the university slept, but Aris Thorn was wide awake, a man haunted by a single unproven idea. His career was a testament to such hauntings. A flash of memory intruded, a younger, brighter version of himself at a podium in Vienna, presenting a paper on Pleistocene genetic drift to a room of politely bored faces, the subsequent publication in a minor journal, the slow, then rapid withdrawal of grant support as his focus narrowed from broad human migration patterns to what his detractors called frivolous trait tracking, the final, humiliating reassignment to this basement lab, a glorified storage closet with a fume hood, where he was expected to process routine samples and cause no further trouble. He pushed the memory away. It was the price of seeing what others could not. Tonight, he would pay a different price. He had spent weeks meticulously drilling a microscopic sample of powder from the thickest part of the fragment, a process that felt like desecration even with all permits in order. The powder now sat in a solution within a polymerase chain reaction machine, its ancient DNA being amplified, letter by biochemical letter. The machine beeped, its cycle complete. Aris's heart thudded against his ribs. He transferred the sample to the sequencer, a sleek silver box that hummed with potential. As it began its work, he paced the narrow room, his reflection a gaunt, shadowy figure in the dark window glass. He saw the streaks of premature grey in his dishevelled hair, the permanent tension in his jaw. The man in the glass was a cautionary tale, a scholar who had traded respect for a hunch. Hours bled away. Dawn tinged the sky a dull grey beyond the window. The sequencer chimed its completion. Aris sank into his chair before the monitor, the blue light washing over his face. He navigated through the raw data, strings of As, Ts, Cs and Gs, the alphabet of life. He aligned the sequence against the human reference genome, filtering out microbial contamination and modern human error. The familiar regions matched up, confirming the sample's human origin. Then his eyes caught an anomaly. In the region of the OCA2 gene, a key regulator of melanin production, the sequence diverged, not a major deletion or insertion, but a single nucleotide polymorphism, a point mutation so tiny it was like a single typo in a library of books, a cytosine where a thymine should have been. He checked the calibration. He ran the alignment again. The result held. It was a mutation known to be associated with reduced melanin in the iris in modern populations. But its context here was all wrong. The surrounding genetic architecture was archaic, bearing markers of a deep, pre-Neolithic European lineage. A cold, electric thrill shot through him. This was not a modern contaminant. This mutation was ancient, contemporary with the bone itself. He isolated the code, highlighting it on his screen. It glowed, a singular, silent message from the past. He named it, typing the label with trembling fingers, *marker X*. For a long moment, he simply stared. This changed everything. It was not definitive proof of blue eyes. Phenotype from genotype was a complex dance, but it was the first genetic whisper of the possibility from that era. His theory was no longer just about bone structure. He had a molecular witness. Exhaustion hit him like a physical wave, but beneath it surged a vindication so potent it was dizzying. He thought of the individual who had carried this skull, who had lived and died by the Cantabrian Sea 7,000 years ago. What had they seen with those eyes? Had the world looked different through a lens of less pigment? Had it mattered at all? He saved the data across 3 separate drives, a ritual of paranoid preservation born from professional scars. As he did, the memory of his downfall returned, not as a sting, but as a backdrop. The laughter in the faculty lounge, the pointed questions about practical application. Vance's final verdict. Thorn. History is written in broad strokes of survival and adaptation, not in the colour of someone's eyes. You're chasing a footnote. Iris looked back at the sequence on the screen, at the glowing annotation for marker X. A footnote, perhaps, but this footnote was a genesis. It was a spark in the deep dark of prehistory, a single, accidental change in the code of a long-dead human being. And he, Aris Thorn, the disgraced footnote chaser, had found it. He leaned back, the first faint rays of morning sun piercing the high basement window and illuminating the dust motes dancing above the ancient skull fragment. The caveman's gaze, empty and dark for millennia, seemed to hold a new, faint light. Asterisk. Chapter 2, The First Spark. Part 1. Asterisk. The spark, once ignited, demanded a source. Marker X existed, a solitary anomaly in a sea of genomic data, but for Aris Thorn, it was not enough to know it was ancient. He needed to see it born. The sterile, humming quiet of his basement lab became a temporal engine room, and the tool for this act of virtual genesis was the bioinformatics simulator, a program usually employed to model population migrations or disease spread. Aris had spent 72 sleepless hours modifying its code, stripping away the macro-scale parameters to focus on the infinitesimally small, on the cellular machinery of a single human body in a single moment of deep time. He fed the simulator everything he had, the precise mutation, its genomic context, the estimated allele frequencies from the Mesolithic period, paleoclimate data from the Holocene, and anthropological models of early hunter-gatherer band sizes. The program was not a time machine, but it was a probability forge. It would run 1 million iterations, 1 billion, until the most statistically plausible origin story for Marker X coalesced from the digital chaos. Iris initiated the sequence, the server fans whirring in protest, and waited for the past to render itself on his screen. The visualization window bloomed to life, not with numbers but with a landscape. It was a speculative reconstruction, yet the details were agonizingly vivid, drawn from archaeological consensus. A rolling steppe near the northwestern shores of the Black Sea, 10,000 years before the present. The sky was a vast pale bowl, and the wind moved through grasses that rippled like a pelt. The simulator, in its cold logic, had pinpointed a location and a time, a small seasonal camp of a hunter-gatherer group during the late Mesolithic. The focus zoomed, tunneling through the abstraction of a population to a single point of light representing one individual. Aris leaned forward, his breath fogging the cool screen. The program generated a phenotypic profile. Based on the surrounding genetic markers, the individual was an adult, though the exact age was blurred by probability. The skin was dark, rich with melanin, evolved under a sun that knew no mercy. The hair was dark and tightly curled. The eyes, modelled on the dominant alleles of the era, were a deep dark brown. This was no Nordic ancestor from popular imagination. This was a person whose entire physiology was a testament to survival under an ancient migrating sun. They were shown in a moment of mundane life, using a finely worked flint tool to scrape a hide stretched between wooden stakes. The simulation gave no name, no gender, no story beyond existence. It was a biological vessel, and within it, a process was underway. In a silent, microscopic theatre within the body, a somatic cell was dividing. The simulator visualized this, not as a biological diagram, but as a cascade of luminous code, double helices unwinding like golden ladders in a dark void, enzymes proofread, nucleotides paired. The process was one of near-perfect fidelity, a copying of the self that had succeeded trillions of times before in this lineage. But perfection is a statistical illusion. In the region of chromosome 15, within the OCA2 gene, the replication machinery encountered a fleeting instability, a quantum misstep. A single adenine on the template strand should have dictated a thymine in the new copy. Instead, through an error so minuscule it bordered on the metaphysical, a cytosine was incorporated. The simulation highlighted the event with a pulse of cool blue light. A single nucleotide substitution, AC. It was over in a picosecond. This birth of a typo. The cell did not shudder. The individual scraping the hide felt no ripple of change, no cosmic tremor. The new cell, now carrying this unique mutation in its nucleus, went on to function or die according to the ruthless dictates of somatic life. If it was a skin cell, it would slough away. If it was a cell destined for the gonads, a gamete, the simulation's probability trees branched wildly here. Then the story could continue. Aris watched, mesmerized by the profound insignificance of the moment. The mutation was recessive, a silent instruction that would do nothing unless paired with another copy. In this individual, it was a ghost, a secret locked in a single cell among billions. It conferred no advantage in hunting or gathering, no resistance to disease, no heightened fertility. It was neutral, a biological whisper lost in the roar of survival. The simulator calculated the odds of this specific mutation arising and being passed on as vanishingly small, a decimal point followed by a string of zeros. Yet, probability only governs the likely, reality accommodates the actual. The office door swung open with a force that shattered the digital reverie. Dr. Elias Vance filled the doorway, his tailored suit a stark contrast to Aris's rumpled lab coat. Vance's expression was a familiar blend of impatience and disdain, his eyes scanning the room before landing on the glowing monitor with its frozen pastoral scene and highlighted genetic code. "Thorn," Vance said, the single word a dismissal in itself. "The quarterly review was due yesterday. I assume this is what occupied you." He gestured vaguely at the screen. Aris straightened, a familiar defensiveness tightening his shoulders. "I've made a significant find, a point mutation origin. I'm modeling its genesis." Vance stepped closer, peering at the visualization. He snorted, a short, derisive sound. "A genesis? You've made a cartoon?" This is bioinformatics' parlor trick, Iris. Pretty lights and speculative landscapes. He tapped a finger on the desk beside the monitor. The Institute funds research with tangible outcomes, population health, evolutionary medicine, not digital ancestor simulations. This isn't science, it's historical fiction with a genetic skin. The mutation is real, Iris insisted, his voice low. The model is built on real data. It shows the when and where of a trait that defines millions today. And what is the so what? Vance's voice hardened. So a brown-eyed person had a mutation. Did it help them? Did it spread because it was useful? Your own simulation shows it didn't. It's genetic noise, a curiosity. He fixed Iris with a steely gaze. The advisory board is convening next week. Your current project allocation is under review. Given your track record of pursuing academic will-o'-the-wisps, I will be recommending a full reallocation of your resources to the Neolithic Dietary Isotope Project. It has clear publication pathways. The threat hung in the air, colder than the lab's conditioned breeze. The funding was a lifeline. The difference between continuing and having his servers shut off, his samples archived, his access revoked. This is the foundation of a major discovery, Iris said, the conviction in his voice belying the chill in his gut. It's the foundation of your professional obituary if you keep this up, Vance replied, turning to leave. He paused at the door. Clean this fantasy up, Iris. Submit the overdue reports. Maybe then we can discuss you keeping your microscopes. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving a silence more oppressive than before. Iris turned back to the screen. The simulation was paused on the face of the dark-skinned, dark-eyed hunter, the flint tool in their hand, the invisible mutation a secret in their cells, the parlor trick, the genetic noise. He felt the old, familiar weight of dismissal, but it now settled on something solid, on marker X. Vance saw a dead end. Iris saw a fork in the river of inheritance, so small it was nearly imperceptible, but one that would, through the blind, meandering paths of chance and time, carve a new channel through humanity. He moved the cursor and unpaused the simulation. The digital wind stirred the grass again. The story against all odds and departmental politics was not over. It had only just begun. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 2. The First Spark. Part 2. Asterisk. The simulation, unpaused, flowed forward through compressed generations. The individual with the secret in their cells, the child of that single nucleotide substitution, did not die young. The model, incorporating mortality tables from forensic anthropology, allowed them to survive the perils of the Mesolithic steppe, the seasonal hunger, the opportunistic infections, the ever-present threat of predator and accident. The child grew, their body maturing under the vast sky, the mutation carried silently within a subset of their gametes, a dormant potential. They reached reproductive age, found a mate within the small mobile band, and had children of their own. Iris watched as the visualization shifted from a single luminous point to a branching tree. The first generation passed. The recessive mutation, hidden in the genetic shuffle, was passed to approximately half of the offspring, according to Mendelian probability. None of these children expressed the trait. They carried only one copy, making them carriers. Their eyes, like those of their parents and all their known world, remained a deep, absorptive brown. The mutation was a ghost in the bloodstream of the lineage, invisible, irrelevant to the daily struggle for existence. It conferred no advantage in spotting game on the horizon, or in withstanding the glare off a winter plain. It was, as Vance had sneered, genetic noise. Yet the simulation, running its millions of probabilistic iterations, began to trace a different story. It was not a story of adaptation, but of sheer dumb luck, the kind of luck that governs the survival of neutral traits in small isolated populations. The hunter-gatherer band, perhaps 50 strong, migrated slowly northwest over decades, following herds and seasonal plant cycles. They encountered other bands, exchanged members, shared genes. The mutation, carried by a few unsuspecting individuals, stowed away on these journeys. Its frequency wobbled. Sometimes it nearly vanished when a carrier died without children. Sometimes it doubled when a carrier by chance had several surviving offspring. Iris's focus narrowed from the sweeping landscape visuals to the raw data streaming alongside them. He ran calculations, his fingers flying over the keyboard. He modeled effective population sizes, calculated the coefficient of inbreeding for these early groups, and plotted the allele frequency against time. The numbers told a tale of miraculous tenacity. For a neutral mutation, one that offered no selective benefit, to not only persist but to slowly, incrementally, increase its representation over centuries, was a statistical marvel. It required a perfect storm of demographic stability, a degree of isolation to prevent dilution, and a generous helping of genetic drift, the random fluctuation of gene versions in a small pool. He leaned back, the glow of the screen etching lines of awe onto his tired face. This was not natural selection in the classic Darwinian sense. There was no survival of the fittest here, only the survival of the fortuitous. The mutation had not spread because it was better asterisk. It had spread because it was not bad enough to be eliminated asterisk. It was a genetic hitchhiker, riding along on the robust genome of its carriers, its destiny tied entirely to their reproductive success. The blue-eye allele, he realized with dawning clarity, was a masterpiece of evolutionary neutrality. The simulation reached a critical threshold after hundreds of virtual years, in a descendant community now settled in a forested valley north of the Great Plains. Two carriers of the mutation, distant cousins several times removed, neither knowing the hidden legacy they carried, produced a child. The visualization zoomed in, the probabilistic fog clearing for this pivotal moment. The child's genotype was passed, 2 copies of the mutant OCA2 allele. The phenotypic algorithm rendered the outcome. The infant's eyes were not brown. The simulation, avoiding anthropomorphism, simply highlighted the iris structure with a cool cerulean tint. The melanocytes, following the new recessive genetic instruction, deposited only a minimal amount of melanin pigment. The underlying collagenous stroma of the iris now exposed, scattered incoming light, reflecting back the shorter blue wavelengths. It was a simple biophysical trick, a subtractive process. The world this child would see was no different in acuity or function, but the window through which it was viewed was unprecedented in their lineage. Aris stared, a profound chill tracing his spine. He had not just modelled the origin of a mutation, he had witnessed the probabilistic birth of a new human phenotype. This child, born to a community where every gaze was dark, was unique. The simulation did not speculate on the social ramifications, whether it was seen as an omen, a curiosity, or merely a minor oddity. It only tracked the genetic consequence. This child, possessing the trait fully expressed, would pass the mutation to all of their offspring, guaranteeing its more prominent presence in the next generation's gene pool. The implications crystallized with the force of a physical blow. Aris halted the simulation, freezing the image of the blue highlighted iris. His calculations scrolled beside it, all the complex variables, population bottlenecks, migration routes, random drift, they all funneled back to a single, irreducible source. Every iteration of the model, every statistically plausible pathway for the allele's survival, originated from that one-point mutation in that one individual 10 millennia ago. The mathematics of coalescent theory pointed to a single common ancestor for this specific genetic variant. He was looking at the genetic equivalent of Adam, or Eve. The terminology was theological and flawed, implying a singular first couple for all traits, which was genetically absurd. But for this one tiny piece of the human mosaic, this specific mutation on chromosome 15 responsible for the widespread occurrence of blue eyes, the data suggested a single origin, a genetic Adam for blue eyes. One person, living and dying on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, whose cellular machinery had made a single copying error, had inadvertently become the progenitor of a trait that would millennia later be carried by hundreds of millions. The weight of the thought was immense, humbling. It reduced vast swathes of human diversity, often weaponized to divide, to a story of incredible fragile chance. It connected a CEO in Stockholm, a fisherman in Crete, a teacher in Michigan, all blue-eyed, through an unbroken thread-thin line of descent to this one dark-skinned, dark-eyed hunter-gatherer who had never known the color their mutation would one day unveil. The buzz of his desk phone shattered the silence. It was Vance's assistant, her voice clipped, reminding him of the overdue budgetary forms. The mundane intrusion was a violent wrench back to a present that seemed suddenly small and petty. Aris murmured an acknowledgement and hung up. He looked from the phone to the frozen simulation on his monitor, from the bureaucratic present to the deep, resonant past he had just touched. He saved the data, the entire probabilistic journey from a single nucleotide to a Collidor Express trait. The findings were explosive, controversial, and utterly defensible on mathematical grounds. He had pinpointed not just a mutation, but a moment of singular genetic genesis. The parlor trick had revealed a cornerstone. Dr. Vance and the Institute board could threaten his funding, his lab, his career, but they could not threaten the quiet, monumental truth now glowing on his screen, that a world of blue eyes had begun with a spark in the dark, a secret carried in the blood of one ancient child who lived, loved, and passed on a ghost, waiting for the chance collision of genetics to bring it, quite accidentally, into the light. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 3. The Outcast's Legacy. Asterisk. Asterisk. The paper was a controlled detonation. Aris titled it with stark simplicity. A coalescent model for a derived OCA2 haplotype suggests a single, late Mesolithic origin for the blue iris phenotype. He submitted it to Nature Genetics *, knowing it would be rejected, and used the predictably scathing peer reviews, highly speculative, lacks mechanistic validation, of narrow anthropological interest, to fuel a different strategy. He posted a preprint on an open-access bioRxiv server, stripped of academic caution, framing the finding as a narrative, the genetic Adam of blue eyes. It went viral in 48 hours. The scientific community reacted with a mixture of fascination and profound irritation. Population geneticists picked apart his models on blogs. Anthropologists debated the social implications of trait origin stories. News outlets, always hungry for a simple human angle, ran with headlines like "Scientists Find the First Blue-Eyed Person." For 2 weeks, Aris's inbox was a cacophony of interview requests, hate mail from obscurantists who felt their heritage was being stolen, and earnest messages from blue-eyed people sharing family lore. He ignored most of it, working in a state of hyper-focused isolation, refining his simulations against every criticism he found valid. The basement lab felt both like a bunker and a lighthouse, emitting a signal he could no longer control. The invitation arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, an email with a crisp.dk domain. The sender was Professor Elara Mikkelsen of the University of Copenhagen's Center for Geogenetics. The subject line was, "RIAR bioRxiv submission, Marker X and the Baltic bottleneck." Her message was brief, devoid of the usual academic flattery. She had read his paper. She found the methodology unorthodox, but the central premise intriguing, perhaps testable against her team's ongoing work on ancient mitochondrial DNA from Scandinavian bog remains. She was organizing a small interdisciplinary symposium on post-glacial human recolonization of northern Europe. Would he consider presenting his findings? Travel and accommodation would be covered. Aris read it 3 times. It was not an endorsement, but it was a door cracking open in a wall of professional dismissal. Elara Mikkelsen was a respected name, known for rigorous, large-scale paleogenomic studies. Her interest was a thread of legitimacy. He accepted within the hour. Copenhagen in autumn was a study in soft greys and gleaming copper spires. The conference was held in a modern auditorium, all blonde wood and clean lines, a world away from his basement. Aris presented his data, his voice echoing slightly in the half-full room. He showed the simulation, the step, the single nucleotide change, the probabilistic spread. He spoke of genetic drift as a creative force. The audience, a mix of geneticists, archaeologists, and climatologists, listened with polite analytical reserve. The questions afterward were technical, probing his assumptions about effective population size. No one called it a parlor trick. Aris studied the data. It was beautiful, clean evidence. His simulation had modeled this effect abstractly, but here was the concrete, regional reality. The Baltic bottleneck was a documented genetic event, a funnel. If his allele had fallen into that funnel, its modern prevalence in Northern Europe was no longer just a miracle of drift, but an almost predictable outcome of prehistoric geography and climate. "You're saying my genetic Adam might have been a Scandinavian founder," Eris said, his mind racing. "I'm saying your Adam's child, or grandchild might have been," Elara corrected, a hint of a smile touching her lips. "The mutation arose where you said, near the Black Sea. Our data suggests a migration route northwest, along river valleys, reaching the Baltic Basin. The timing fits. The bottleneck would have captured the allele, and simply by the mathematics of small populations, could have inflated its frequency from a rare oddity to a common trait within a few hundred generations. No selection required, just a genetic lottery win in an isolated corner of the post-glacial world." The noise of the reception faded. Iris saw the story snap into sharper focus. It was no longer just a spark and a slow burn. It was a spark, a journey, and then a sudden dramatic magnification. Ilara's skepticism was not dismissal. It was the application of a different lens, one that brought the blurry background of his theory into startling clarity. "You have the skeletal remains?" he asked, his voice low. "We have many, some from the bottleneck period itself. We haven't targeted OCA2 specifically. It wasn't a priority." She looked at him, her flinty eyes now alight with a shared curiosity. "It could be. Now, a collaboration could test your hypothesis directly, extract nuclear DNA from our bottleneck-era samples. Look for marker X." The word hung between them. Asterisk collaboration. Asterisk. For Aris, it was a lifeline thrown from a ship he thought had sailed. For Elara, it was a chance to add a vivid human detail to her broad demographic maps. It was a transaction of mutual interest, but in that moment it felt like the start of a conversation that could bridge his isolated proof of concept to the grand, messy narrative of human prehistory. He looked out the window at the grey Copenhagen evening, the lanterns beginning to glow along the canal. The outcast's legacy, it seemed, was not destined to remain a lonely footnote. It was becoming a joint expedition into the past, guided by a Danish geneticist who saw not a parlour trick, but a missing piece of a puzzle she was already assembling. The spark from the step had travelled far, and now, in this clean Nordic light, it had found a new kind of oxygen. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 4. Waves of Migration. Part 1. Asterisk. The collaboration began not with grand pronouncements, but with the quiet, meticulous merging of datasets. In a borrowed office at the Centre for Geogenetics, its walls lined with shelves of core samples and ancient bone fragments, Aris Thorne and Elara Mikkelsen sat before a bank of monitors. His files, containing the precise genomic coordinates of marker X and the sprawling probabilistic models of its spread, were imported into her team's robust archaeological geographic information system. Her data, a treasure trove of radiocarbon dates, mitochondrial haplotypes, and precise excavation maps from dozens of Mesolithic and Neolithic sites across northern Europe, provided a scaffold of reality upon which his genetic ghost could walk. Lines of code intertwined, scatterplots bloomed with new layers of information. The narrative was shifting from simulation to reconstructed history. The merged model revealed a clear pathway. The descendants of that first carrier did not remain on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. As the Holocene climate warmed, pioneering groups from the fertile crescent of agriculture began their slow, inexorable expansion northwest, bringing domesticated wheat, sheep, and a new way of life. These early farmers, known to archaeologists as the linear pottery culture, moved along the river valleys of Central Europe like a slow tide. The model, superimposing genetic probability over archaeological evidence, showed a trickle of the hunter-gatherer lineage, carrying the silent mutation, merging with these advancing agricultural communities. It was not a conquest, but an absorption, a subtle weaving of genes. The blue eye allele, still recessive and hidden, became a stowaway on the greatest revolution in human history, the dawn of farming. The narrative, now grounded in Elara's empirical framework, demanded a human face. The data points coalesced into a vignette, a plausible moment along that migration route 8,000 years ago. Asterisk, asterisk, Asterisk. The sun hung low over a river valley, painting the wooden longhouses of a Neolithic village in gold and long shadow. The air smelled of wood smoke, tilled earth, and the pungent scent of penned goats. This was the frontier of agriculture, a settled community of perhaps 200 souls, their lives dictated by the seasons of sowing and reaping. In the fading light, a young woman knelt by the riverbank, grinding barley on a saddle quern. The rhythmic scrape of stone on stone, a familiar song. Her name was lost to time, but her genetics were not. She was a descendant, many generations removed, of the steppe hunter and the early farmer, and in her the long-dormant ghost had surfaced. She looked up as a child, called out, her eyes catching the last of the sunlight. They were a startling pale blue, the colour of a shallow summer sky, in a village where every other gaze was varying shades of brown, from dark peat to warm amber. Her eyes were an anomaly. They did not glow with unearthly light, nor were they considered a mark of the gods. They were simply different. The other villagers had known her since birth, watched the unusual pigment solidify in infancy. She was not shunned. Her family was well regarded, her father a skilled knapper of flint sickles. Her odd eyes were a topic of occasional curiosity, a feature noted and then folded into the fabric of her identity. She was the girl with the sky eyes, who could sometimes be seen squinting in the bright afternoon sun, her eyelids narrowing to slits. Some of the elders murmured that her sight must be weaker, that the world must look washed out to her, but she harvested grain and threaded needles as well as anyone. The difference was neutral, as the genetics had always been. It inspired neither reverence nor fear, only a mild, persistent note of otherness. Children sometimes stared, until their mothers hushed them. Young men glanced at her with a curiosity that was more anthropological than romantic. She herself had no mirror but the still pools of the river, where she would peer at her own reflection, puzzled by the pale circles that looked back, so unlike her mother's deep, comforting brown. She wondered, in a vague, pre-scientific way, if some piece of the vast pale sky had gotten trapped inside her during her birth on a clear autumn day. The allele she carried was no longer a solitary secret. The model showed that within this isolated village, founded by a small band of migrating farmers, the gene's frequency had risen to perhaps 1 in 30. There were other carriers, their brown eyes hiding the potential. Unknowingly, the community had become a reservoir. The woman's blue eyes were a visible flag, a chance manifestation of the hidden legacy moving through their blood. When she married, which she would, to a man with kind brown eyes, half her children would carry the gene. If by the blind luck of matchmaking she married another carrier, the sky-coloured eyes would look out at the world again. As twilight deepened, she finished her grinding, gathered the coarse flour in a hide, and walked back to the longhouse. Smoke curled from the roof hole. The sounds of family, the smell of stewing herbs enveloped her. Her odd eyes saw the same hearth fire, the same familiar faces, the same looming forest beyond the palisade. The world was not washed out. It was simply the world, viewed through a rare biological lens. The great waves of migration, the farmer's tide that had brought her ancestors to this valley, had deposited this tiny peculiar grain of genetic sand here. It persisted not because it was needed, but because it was not a hindrance. It was a passenger on humanity's journey, a quiet fellow traveller, whose story was written not in deeds or tools, but in the subtle, scattering light of an iris. In the Copenhagen office, Iris watched the geographic display light up with a new node, representing this village, this moment. A single pale blue dot pulsed on the map, a visual echo of the woman's eyes. It was surrounded by a sea of brown, but it held firm. Elara pointed to the demographic parameters running alongside the map. Isolation, she said quietly. Small effective population size, minimal gene flow from outside groups. It's a perfect petri dish for a neutral trait. It doesn't spread here because it's useful. It just endures. Iris nodded, watching the dot. It was no longer just a statistical output. It was a young woman by a river, a community that accepted a slight difference, a genetic thread that had survived the long journey from the steppe. The spark had travelled on the waves of migration, not as a guiding light, but as a piece of flotsam washed up on a distant shore, waiting for the slow, patient currents of generations to carry it forward again. The story of Blue Eyes was not one of destiny, but of sheer stubborn continuity amidst the churn of human movement. Asterisk. Chapter 4, Waves of Migration, Part 2, Asterisk. The River Valley Village, with its sky-eyed woman, represented a quiet eddy in the stream of time. But the currents of prehistory were shifting again, brewing a storm on the eastern steppes that would churn the genetic waters of Europe beyond recognition. In the Copenhagen lab, the merged model of Ares and Elara advanced its timeline another 3,000 years. The serene agricultural dots on the map representing Neolithic farmers were about to be overrun by a new wave of luminous points, sweeping in from the Eurasian plains like a prairie fire. The Yamnaya, the narrative vignette, now guided by the hard data of ancient DNA studies, shifted east. The scene opened not on settled fields, but on an endless expanse of grassland under a vault of immense sky. This was the domain of the pastoralists, a culture built on the backs of horses and wheels. The Yamnaya were not farmers tied to a plot of earth. They were herders, warriors, and pioneers of the chariot. Their society was mobile, hierarchical, and expansive. Driven by climate shifts, population pressures, and the revolutionary advantages of wheeled vehicles, they began a westward migration that would reshape a continent. They moved in groups, their wagons laden with belongings, their herds of cattle and sheep a moving food source, their genetic signature, tall stature, lactose tolerance, and a propensity for certain paternal lineages, a stamp about to be pressed deep into the European genome. Among these migrating bands, the model highlighted a few individuals. Their genetic profiles, extrapolated from Yamnaya burial mounds, showed a mixture of Eastern hunter-gatherer and Caucasian ancestry, and in a handful of these profiles, the algorithm detected the familiar signature, marker X. The blue eye allele had not originated with them, but somewhere in the complex mingling of peoples on the steppe, perhaps from earlier contacts with the descendants of that first carrier, it had been adopted. It was now a passenger on this new powerful vector of migration. The visualization depicted a Yamnaya band making camp at the edge of the great forests of Central Europe, a region already inhabited by the descendants of the earlier farmers. The encounter was not a simple replacement. It was a collision, a negotiation, and ultimately a profound mixing. The Yamnaya, with their pastoral wealth and martial prowess, often assumed dominant social positions. They took mates from local farming communities. Children were born from these unions, inheriting a mosaic of traits: the robust frame of the steppe rider, the agriculturalist's immune adaptations, and sometimes a recessive allele for blue eyes from either side of the family tree. Elara zoomed in on the demographic output. "Look here," she said, her finger tracing a steep curve on a graph. "The Yamnaya migration introduces a massive influx of new genes. The population structure is shattered and remade. But notice the frequency of marker X. The graph showed a line representing the allele's prevalence, which had plateaued at a low level during the Neolithic. Now, as the model simulated the Yamnaya period, the line jagged sharply upward, nearly doubling within a few simulated centuries. "Is it selective?" Ares asked, leaning in. "Did it somehow confer an advantage in this new mixed society?" Elara ran a statistical test, the results flashing on screen. "No correlation with any fitness proxy we can model. Survival to reproductive age, number of offspring, nothing. The allele frequency is increasing, but the trait itself isn't being selected for. It's hitchhiking." The concept of genetic hitchhiking was not new, but seeing it play out on this scale was breathtaking. The Yamnaya were not spreading the blue-eye gene because they valued it. They were spreading their entire genome with unprecedented efficiency due to their demographic success. Any alleles they carried, beneficial, neutral, or even slightly deleterious, were swept along in the tide. Marker X, floating passively in the gene pool of some Yamnaya migrants, was caught in this genetic riptide. As Yamnaya ancestry proliferated across Europe, so too did the chance presence of that one tiny mutation. It was dilution and amplification simultaneously. The local European gene pool was diluted by steppe ancestry, but a specific, neutral trait within that steppe ancestry was amplified purely by association. The human story within the data focused on a mixed heritage child born in a settlement on the Danube plain. His father was a Yamnaya metalsmith, his mother a potter from a long-settled farming lineage. The boy had his father's height and his mother's smile, and he had eyes of a clear grey-blue, a shade not seen in his mother's family for generations. The allele, carried silently by his Yamnaya father, had met a matching copy from his mother's farmer ancestry, a lineage that traced back through millennia of quiet endurance to that river valley village and beyond. The trait expressed itself anew, a recombination of ancient threads. In this tumultuous blended world, the boy's eye colour was less of an oddity. The Yamnaya migrations had brought together so many physical variations, different skull shapes, skin tones, hair textures, that a pair of light eyes was just another feature in a growing spectrum of human diversity. It was not yet a common trait, but it was no longer a solitary curiosity. It was becoming part of the varied tapestry of a transforming continent. Back in the present, Aris stared at the map. It was now a dynamic animation of flowing colours, the steady green wash of the early farmers, followed by the explosive amber wave of the Yamnaya, sweeping in from the east, dots of pale blue, representing carriers and expressors of the allele, sparkled within both waves, multiplying notably after the collision. The model was clear. The doubling of the gene's frequency was a demographic side effect, a statistical inevitability given the population turnover. The Great Steppe Migration had acted less like a selective force and more like a giant chaotic blender. Marker X had been thrown into the mix, and by the simple, brutal mathematics of who survived and reproduced in that era of upheaval, it had emerged more common. Genetic drift on a continental scale, Aris murmured, the awe evident in his voice. Not survival of the fittest, survival of the luckiest, carried on the coattails of a demographic juggernaut. Ilara nodded, saving the simulation sequence. It debunks the romantic notion, she said. No ancient tribe of blue-eyed warriors conquered Europe. Instead, a few blue-eyed individuals happened to be part of a warrior culture that did conquer, or at least massively influence Europe. Their eye colour was irrelevant. Their culture's success was everything for the gene's spread. The story was becoming profoundly humbling. The trait that would one day be iconic of certain European populations was not a badge of a superior people. It was a genetic lottery ticket that happened to be in the pocket of some migrants during one of history's great population shuffles. Its spread was a side effect of human movement, conflict, and integration, a passive witness to the end of one world and the violent creative birth of another. The waves of migration had not been waves of blue eyes, they had been waves of people, and a few specks of blue had simply ridden the tide. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 5. The Viking Vector. Asterisk. Asterisk. The Copenhagen rain had softened to a fine mist, blurring the lanterns along the Nyhavn Canal into smears of gold. Inside the National Museum of Denmark, the air was dry and still, thick with the silence of curated centuries. Ilara led Aris through a vaulted hall, their footsteps echoing on polished stone. She stopped before a long glass case, its interior lit with a soft, reverent glow. Inside, arranged on a bed of dark velvet, lay the skeletal remains of a Viking-era burial, a rusted sword, a shattered shield boss, a few silver coins and the bones themselves, a cranium, a rib cage, long limbs laid out with archaeological precision. Gravhøj 8, near Roskilde, Ilara said, her voice low in the hush. Male, late 20s, 9th century. She pointed not at the sword but at the skull. The orbital sockets were dark, empty voids, but the bone structure was broad and robust. Genetically, he clusters with the Icelandic founding population. We've sequenced him. He carried marker X. Iris leaned closer, studying the contours of the face that was no longer there. The simulation's abstract dots and flowing maps solidified into this stark reality. A man who had sailed, fought and died over 1,000 years ago, carrying within his cells the same genetic whisper Iris had first isolated in a Spanish bone fragment. The journey from the Mesolithic steppe to a Danish museum case felt vertiginous. The Yamnaya were a blender, Ilara continued. moving down the case to another display showing a map of Viking trade routes, arcs of light stretching from Newfoundland to Constantinople. The Norse were a delivery system. Her finger traced the lines radiating from Scandinavia. They didn't just raid, they settled, they traded. They took wives and concubines from every coast they touched, and wherever they went, their genes went with them. She guided him to a large wall map, dotted with pins and annotated with genetic data. Look, Iceland, settled in the late 9th century, a founder population of perhaps 20,000, mostly Norsemen and Celtic women from the British Isles. Our models show marker X's frequency in medieval Iceland was already over 30%. It came with the settlers, Greenland too, briefly. Then the British Isles, not just the Danelaw but deep into Ireland, Scotland, through trade and settlement, coastal Normandy, the Baltic shores, the river routes into Russia. Her explanation was clinical, but the implication was profound. The Viking Age was not merely a chapter of history, it was a powerful, targeted vector for genetic distribution. The allele, having been amplified in Scandinavia by the earlier bottleneck and Yamnaya admixture, was now packaged into the mobile, reproductively successful populations of the Norse. Their explorations acted as a genetic pump, injecting the trait into new distant gene pools with startling efficiency. A raiding party might leave behind more than burned buildings. It could leave behind a genetic legacy in unborn children. A trading post established a beachhead for genes as well as goods. It becomes associated, Elara said, a note of caution entering her voice. She turned from the map to face him. In the medieval period, and especially later, with the rise of national romanticism in the 19th century, physical traits become linked to identity. The Viking becomes a type, tall, blonde, blue-eyed. The reality was always more mixed, but the stereotype takes root. This trait, she gestured back at the skeleton in the case, ceases to be just a random biological variant. It becomes a marker, a signifier of Nordic ancestry, of certain groups. Iris felt a familiar unease, cold and slick, coiling in his stomach. He had pursued marker X as a puzzle in pure population genetics, a story of drift, migration and chance. It was a mathematical narrative, clean in its neutrality. But here, in the shadow of these bones and maps, the science was brushing against the jagged rocks of human tribalism. His neutral hitchhiker was being drafted into histories of conquest and belonging. He thought of the dark-skinned, dark-eyed progenitor on the steppe, the ultimate source. That individual belonged to no modern nation, no constructed race. The gene had passed through farmers, herders, and now sailors. It was a traveller, not a native. Yet here it was, enshrined in a museum, as part of a specifically Norse cultural display. The same trait would later be fetishized, weaponized, by 20th century racial scientists to support vile hierarchies. His own data, if misunderstood, could be misused to draw bold, false lines between peoples, to imply a purity of descent that the entire history of the gene contradicted. "It's a perfect example of the illusion," Aris said quietly, more to himself than to Elara. "The trait looks like it defines a population because it's frequent in a region, but its history shows it's a recent arrival there, and it got there by the same messy, often violent processes of human movement that characterize all of history. It's not a core essence, it's a tourist that overstayed." Elara nodded, her expression grim. "Exactly, but people love essential stories. They love the idea that biology and culture are the same. Your research, Iris, traces the tourist's passport stamps. It shows the journey. That is powerful and dangerous." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken hanging between them. The museum felt less like a repository of knowledge and more like a gallery of potential misinterpretations. Every artifact, every skeleton, could be woven into a story of glorious lineage or exclusive heritage. His science could either reinforce those simplistic stories or dismantle them by revealing the astonishing complexity beneath. He looked back at the Viking skeleton. He imagined the man not as a symbol of a people, but as an individual, a young man who perhaps feared the sea, loved a particular dog, enjoyed the taste of smoked fish, who carried, unknowingly, a genetic quirk from a Black Sea hunter 10,000 years dead. That man's life, his journeys, his children, had been one more step in the blind, meandering dissemination of a single nucleotide change. There was a profound humility in that perspective, a stripping away of myth. "We have to frame this carefully," Aris said, the resolve hardening in his voice. "The data is clear. The Viking expansion was a major dispersal mechanism, but the narrative can't be Vikings spread blue eyes. It has to be the Viking demographic expansion carried many genetic variants, including this one, across the North Atlantic. One is a story of a people, the other is a story of a gene's journey, with people as its vessel." Ilara gave him a look of measured approval. "That is the scientific truth, but it is a harder story to tell. It lacks heroes and tribes. It has only statistics and dead carriers." They left the Hall of Viking Remains, walking back through galleries of Stone Age tools and Bronze Age lures. The unease in Aris's gut remained, but it had crystallized into a sense of responsibility. The pure science he loved was not pure in its consequences. It existed in a world hungry for simple origins and clean divisions. His work on Marker X, from its first spark to its Viking-era dispersal, was a testament to exactly the opposite, to mixture, chance, and shared biological threads that utterly disregarded modern borders or identities. The dangerous ideas of ancestry weren't in the data itself. They were in the simplistic, essentialist stories people were desperate to hang upon it. His job, he realized, was not just to uncover the journey, but to narrate it in a way that left no room for those old poisonous myths. The tourist's passport had stamps from countless lands. The story was in the itinerary, not the destination. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 6. A Common Ancestor. Asterisk. Asterisk. The dam broke not with a leak, but a flood. A popular science journalist attending a lecture where Ilara presented their combined findings penned a piece with a headline engineered for virality. "All blue-eyed people are cousins," say geneticists. The article simplified the complex coalescent model into a stunning personal factoid. It omitted the nuances of carrier states, genetic drift, and the thousands of other ancestors in every lineage. It focused solely on the single, identifiable source for the OCA2 mutation. Within hours, the story was everywhere, stripped of all caveats, a genetic soundbite that captivated the global imagination. For Aris Thorn, who had laboured for years in obscurity, the sudden glare of the spotlight was a violent, disorienting shock. His university's press office, which had long ignored him, was now fielding hundreds of calls. His inbox, once a trickle of academic correspondence, became a deluge of media requests, interview proposals, and messages from the public. Television crews camped outside the institute, their satellite trucks lining the curb like a siege engine. He became the Blue Eye Guy, a reluctant celebrity of science. The attention was not uniformly flattering. On a primetime debate program, a prominent evolutionary psychologist, Dr. Leo Chadwick, served as the critic. With a practiced, condescending smile, he dissected the media narrative. "What doctor? Thorne's elegant model. Asterisk. Actually, asterisk implies," Chadwick said, addressing the camera directly, "is that every single blue-eyed person on Earth shares one common ancestor from 10,000 years ago. One. This is a breathtaking claim. It reduces human diversity to a single point of origin for a visible trait. It's genetic determinism of the most reductive kind." Watching from a green room monitor, Iris felt a cold sweat break out. Chadwick had taken the kernel of truth and wrapped it in a misleading absolutist shell. The next morning, headlines blared. Scientist claims single ancestor for all blue eyes. The backlash from other academics was swift, accusing him of media grandstanding and oversimplification. More worryingly, forums dedicated to ethnic purity began citing the headlines as proof of a distinct ancient lineage, twisting his life's work into a banner he despised. The crisis culminated in an invitation to appear on a major morning news show for a live segment. Ilara, watching from Copenhagen, sent a single text, asterisk clarify, "Do not concede." The studio was a blur of lights and cables. The host, a woman with famously intelligent eyes, began with the popular headline, "Dr. Thorne, your research suggests we're all one big blue-eyed family. Is that literally true? Aris took a breath, the camera lens a dark, unblinking eye. He saw not the audience, but the ghost of that first individual on the step, and the endless branching river of descendants that followed. "It's a profound misunderstanding," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "The model does not say every blue-eyed person shares only *1 ancestor. That's genetically impossible. We each have thousands of ancestors from that era. What it shows is that for this *1 specific trait, this single tiny mutation in the OCA2 gene, we can trace its transmission back to a single source, one person 10 millennia ago, in whom this change first occurred. That mutation was then passed down, generation after generation, sometimes hidden, sometimes expressed. So for the asterisk trait, asterisk of blue eyes, yes, there is a single identifiable origin point, but for the asterisk people, asterisk who have it, it is just one thread in the vast, magnificent tapestry of their ancestry." He used his hands, weaving an invisible tapestry in the air. Think of it like a recipe passed through a family. The recipe for a specific cake might have originated with your great-great-grandmother. Everyone who makes that cake uses her recipe, but they are not asterisk, only asterisk, her descendants. They have the genes of all their other ancestors too. For everything else, their height, their smile, their talents, this mutation is just one very old, very persistent recipe for eye color. The clarification, clear and visual, seemed to land. The host nodded, shifting the conversation to the human stories. They played pre-recorded video messages from around the world. A dairy farmer in Wisconsin, his eyes the pale blue of a winter morning, spoke of his Norwegian grandparents. A young woman in Mumbai, with startling sapphire eyes, explained they were a rare family trait, a source of both curiosity and pride. An elderly man in Chile, his eyes faded to a watery grey-blue, recalled his German immigrant father. Each story was unique, a personal chapter in the global dissemination of a genetic signature. Aris watched, his earlier anxiety melting into a deep, resonant connection. These were not data points, they were people, living at the end of a long, fragile thread of inheritance. The studio provided a live link, and calls began to screen. A mother from Seoul, her young son on her lap, asked if his blue eyes, a surprise in their family, meant he was genetically European. Iris gently explained the difference between a single gene and overall ancestry, emphasizing that the mutation itself was ancient and had moved across continents, not belonging to any modern population. The boy, he said, was a beautiful example of how human genes continually mix and recombine in new and unexpected ways. After the segment, the nature of the correspondence shifted. The hate mail and extremist co-option continued, but it was now drowned out by a wave of personal, heartfelt messages. Thousands of people wrote, not to debate the science, but to share their own place in the story. They sent photographs, wedding pictures showing a line of blue-eyed bridesmaids, childhood portraits, close-ups of irises in every shade from ice to stormy grey. They included snippets of family lore, a tale of a blue-eyed ancestor who was a sailor, a story of a trait that skipped generations, the surprise of a blue-eyed child born to brown-eyed parents. Aris, working late in his lab, began to compile these not as data, but as a kind of mosaic. He pinned printouts of the emails and photos on a large bulletin board. The faces stared back at him. Old, young, of every conceivable ethnic background. The single thread from the ancient steppe had been woven into countless human histories, coloured by culture, migration, love, and chance. The common ancestor was not a reducing agent, simplifying humanity to a single point. It was a connector, revealing a shared biological heirloom passed hand to hand across millennia, its meaning shaped entirely by the lives it passed through. He received a final email that night from a university student in California. She wrote, "I always felt my blue eyes made me look too much like my estranged father. It was a feature I disliked. Hearing you talk about it as this ancient accidental gift that connects me to deep history and to millions of strangers, it changed how I see myself. I look in the mirror now and see a chapter in a really long story. Thank you." Aris leaned back. The hum of the lab served as a quiet chorus. The media had sought a sensational, unifying tagline. All blue-eyed people are cousins. They had missed the deeper, more beautiful truth. It wasn't about being cousins in a familial sense. It was about sharing a single, specific inheritance from the deep past, a speck of biological history that highlighted not sameness, but the incredible, branching diversity of the human journey. The common ancestor was not a person to be claimed, but a moment to be acknowledged, a spark in the dark that, through the infinite vagaries of time and chance, had somehow, against all odds, found its way into the light of billions of different faces. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 7. The Siberia Connection. Asterisk. Asterisk. The media frenzy had subsided into a low, persistent hum of academic debate and public fascination. Iris Thorne's bulletin board of personal stories had become a living archive, a testament to the human desire to find oneself in the deep past. He and Alara were back to the quiet work of refining their models, integrating new ancient DNA datasets that trickled in from collaborations across Europe. The story of Marker X seemed to have settled into a coherent, if stunning, narrative, a Black Sea origin, a northwest journey, amplified by the Baltic bottleneck, swept across the continent by Yamnaya migrations, and dispersed by Viking vectors. It was a neat, westward-looking tale. Then the email arrived. It appeared in Eris's inbox on a Tuesday morning, its subject line a stark block of Cyrillic characters transliterated into English. Asterisk. Zapros nasot trudnichestvo. Drevni obratsi. Sibiri. Asterisk. The sender was Dr. Ivan Petrovich, senior researcher at the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography in Novosibirsk. The message was courteous, formal, and earth-shattering. Ivan had read the preprints and the subsequent media coverage. His team had been conducting their own paleogenomic survey of Bronze Age populations from the Altai Mountains and the Yenisei River basin. In 3 separate skeletal remains, dated between 3,000 and 4,500 years old, their preliminary screening had detected a haplotype block on chromosome 15 that matched the signature of Marker X. He included raw data files and a brief archaeological summary. The attached PDF showed photographs of excavated skulls from the permafrost, their orbital sockets staring emptily from a landscape of frozen tundra and jagged peaks. Iris read it twice, then called Alara. He could hear the rustle of papers over the line, the sharp intake of her breath as she opened the files on her end. The silence that followed was profound. "This is impossible," she finally said, her voice a mix of skepticism and awe. "The model, our entire migration map is westward. The allele frequency gradients drop off sharply east of the Urals in every ancient dataset we have." "Ivan's data is clean," Iris replied, scrolling through the genomic alignments. The mutation was there, unmistakable, in contexts that were unequivocally ancient and indigenous to Siberia. The surrounding genetic architecture showed affinities with ancient North Eurasian hunter-gatherers and early Paleo-Siberian populations. Distinct from the European lineages they had been tracking, it didn't just travel west, it went east too, and much earlier than we thought. The implications unfolded like a map in his mind. Their story had been linear, a one-way migration. This was a divergence. The descendants of the original carrier, or perhaps very early carriers, had not only moved with the farming tide toward Europe, some branch had split off, moving in the other direction, following the great herds eastward across the steppe, traversing the Ural Mountains, and embedding themselves into the small, isolated populations of Siberia. The allele, a neutral passenger, had survived in these tiny remote groups, just as it had in the Baltic bottleneck, through sheer genetic drift and isolation. Its frequency would have remained vanishingly low, a rare curiosity in the taiga and tundra, but it had persisted. "We have to see this," Alara said, her tone shifting from shock to decisive action. "We need to verify the extraction protocols, examine the archaeological context. A conference call with Ivan is not enough." A trip to Novosibirsk, to the heart of Siberian academia, was a logistical and bureaucratic mountain. It required visas, institutional approvals, and funding, a resource Iris had in perpetually short supply. There was only one person who could authorize it. He spent the next day preparing, steeling himself for a confrontation he had been avoiding. He needed to face Dr. Vance. The department chair's office was a study in curated authority, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves of leather-bound volumes, an imposing oak desk. a view overlooking the university's manicured quad. Vance was on a call when Aris entered, waving him to a chair without looking up. He finished his conversation with a clipped, "See that it's done," and hung up, turning his full attention to Aris. His expression was one of weary expectation. "Thorn, I assume this is about the latest publicity." "It's about a breakthrough," Iris said, placing a printed summary of Ivan's email and data on the desk. "We've found evidence of the OCA2 mutation in ancient Siberian remains. It changes the entire narrative. We need to go to Novosibirsk to collaborate." Vance picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the lines. Iris watched his face, searching for any flicker of interest beneath the practiced mask of bureaucratic indifference. For a long moment, Vance said nothing. Then he set the paper down, steepling his fingers. "Siberia," he said, the word hanging in the air. "You've built a compelling story for Europe, Iris. A story that, I'll admit, has generated a surprising amount of positive press for the Institute. The common ancestor angle is media gold. It's human, it's relatable, it makes genetics seem warm." He leaned forward slightly. "Now you want to complicate it, to take it to a part of the world that doesn't fit the clean Nordic-centric narrative the public has just begun to digest." "It's not about narratives," Iris insisted, feeling the old frustration rise. "It's about the truth of the data. The gene moved east. That means its history is even more widespread, more complex than we imagined. It's a more powerful story of human interconnection." "Interconnection is a buzzword," Vance replied, but his tone was calculating, not dismissive. He tapped the paper. This could be framed. Global Gene has a better ring than European Gene. It expands the brand, so to speak, makes it more universally marketable." He studied Iris, as if appraising an asset whose value had just shifted. "The Institute's development office has been fielding calls from donors intrigued by your work. A trip to Siberia, it has an air of expedition, of frontier science. It's good optics." Iris felt a cold twist in his gut. Vance wasn't interested in the scientific implications. He was interested in the public relations potential. The pure, humble journey of a nucleotide was being evaluated for its brand expansion. "I can authorize a modest travel grant," Vance continued, making a note on a pad. "Enough for you and Dr. Michelson to go, verify the findings, and produce a co-authored paper. But," he looked up, his gaze sharp and warning, "you will be exceedingly careful with the messaging. This is not about tracing the gene to some pure Siberian tribe, or creating new myths of origin. The last thing we need is for your work to be used to fuel some new flavor of ethnic determinism. You will emphasize the randomness, the drift, the sheer dumb luck of it all. Is that clear?" The warning was explicit, and it echoed Alara's caution in the museum. The science was pure, but its interpretation was a minefield. By extending the story into Siberia, they risked having it misread as evidence of some ancient globe-trotting master race, rather than the story of a genetic stowaway on humanity's myriad, fragmented journeys. "The data speaks for itself," Iris said, his voice flat. "It's a story of isolation and persistence, not superiority." "See that it does," Vance said, returning to his paperwork, a clear dismissal. "The funds will be transferred. Keep me apprised. And Iris, try to come back with something we can put on a brochure." Iris left the office, the approval feeling like a tainted victory. He had the means to pursue the truth, but only because his truth had been deemed marketable. He stood in the polished hallway, the weight of Vance's warning settling on him. The Siberia connection was a scientific revelation, a beautiful complication that shattered a simplistic westward narrative, but it was also a step onto even thinner ice, where the profound neutral history of a gene could be frozen into a tool for division. He thought of the Siberian remains, frozen for millennia in the permafrost, holding their secret. Their story, he vowed, would be told not as a claim, but as a testament to the unexpected, winding paths of human inheritance. The journey east was about to begin. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 8, The Frozen Child, Part 1, asterisk, asterisk. The cold in Novosibirsk was not merely an absence of heat, it was a tangible metallic presence that seeped through the insulated walls of the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnography, a constant reminder of the vast frozen world outside. Dr. Iris Thorne felt it in his bones, a deep chill that seemed to resonate with the antiquity of the specimens they had come to see. The journey had been a marathon of time zones and bureaucratic checkpoints, culminating in this stark, functional building on the outskirts of the city, a fortress of science against the Siberian winter. Dr. Ivan Petrovich met them in a sparse reception area. He was a bear of a man with a thick greying beard and eyes that crinkled with a warmth that defied the climate. His handshake was firm, his English careful but fluent. After brief introductions with Alara, he led them through a maze of linoleum-floored corridors, past closed doors marked with Cyrillic labels, the air carrying the faint, clean scent of ethanol and old stone. The sense of anticipation was a live wire in the sterile silence. "The permafrost is a time capsule," Ivan explained as they walked, his voice a low rumble. "It does not preserve, it suspends flesh, hair, clothing, even the contents of a stomach, and the DNA. It is like it was frozen yesterday." He spoke with the reverence of a man who had spent decades coaxing secrets from the ice. He explained the provenance of their prize, a burial site high in the Altai Mountains, near the Mongolian border, discovered by reindeer herders and excavated with painstaking care 3 years prior. The acidic soil of the tundra had been neutralized by the perpetual cold, creating a perfect microenvironment. The remains were not skeletonized, but mummified. He stopped before a heavy stainless steel door marked with a biohazard symbol and a temperature gauge reading -20 degrees Celsius. Swiping a keycard, he ushered them into an anteroom, a kind of airlock where they donned sterile white coveralls, hairnets, masks, and thick gloves. A second door hissed open, revealing the main cold chamber. The room was a vault of white light and shimmering frost. Rows of metal shelves held plastic crates and vacuum-sealed bags containing fragments of leather, felt, and wood. But Ivan led them to a central examination table, where a climate-controlled glass case rested under a bank of LED lights. Inside, lying on a bed of inert foam, was the child. Iris's breath caught, fogging his mask for a second. The mummy was small, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, curled in a fetal position as if sleeping. The skin was leathery and dark, drawn tight over delicate bones. Wisps of fine brown hair clung to the scalp. The child was dressed in remnants of a fur-lined tunic, the stitching still visible. The face was serene, the eyelids closed over the orbits that had drawn them across continents. Preliminary scans, Ivan had said, suggested unusual morphology in the eye sockets, a subtle hint, nothing more. But standing before the actual remains, the weight of the individual was overwhelming. This was not a data point. This was a person, a life cut short and suspended in time, holding a genetic secret in every desiccated cell. "We call her the Snow Girl in the reports," Ivan said softly, his voice muffled by his mask. "Gender confirmation from the genome. She is from the Afanasyevo culture, pastoralists. Dated to 3,800 years before present. Cause of death unknown, but no visible trauma. She was buried with care. A small ceramic bowl, a carved bone pendant. Her people honored her." Ilara stepped closer, her analytical gaze sweeping over the remains. "The preservation is extraordinary. The collagen integrity must be very high. Unprecedented for this age," Ivan confirmed. "We have sampled a molar for mitochondrial DNA and stable isotopes. The nuclear genome is largely intact, but we have been cautious. She is considered a sacred ancestor by some Altai communities. Our permits for destructive sampling are very narrow, for very specific questions." This was the crux. Ivan had detected the marker X haplotype in a preliminary, low-coverage screening of DNA extracted from a fragment of petrous bone, the densest bone, often used for minimal damage sampling. But to confirm the mutation definitively, to see it in the context of her full genome, and understand her ancestry, they needed a more substantial, deliberate extraction. It would require drilling a tiny core from a long bone, or taking a sample from a specific tooth. It was a violation, however minute, of this ancient body. The protocol, Iris began, the ethical dilemma he had pushed aside during the journey, now rising to the fore. We would need to target the specific region, a milligram of powder at most. Ivan's eyes, above the mask, were grave. The permit allows for one more small sample, for nuclear genomic analysis to confirm cultural affiliation and migration patterns. The Regional Heritage Committee approved it because our initial findings showed possible connections to both West Eurasian steppe populations and indigenous Siberian groups, a puzzle they wish solved. But the permit states the research must be for anthropological understanding, not for— He hesitated. Not for trait chasing. Ilara finished for him, her tone neutral. She looked at Eris. If we take the sample under the guise of broader genomic analysis, and we find the mutation, it is a valid discovery within the scope, but our primary motive is the mutation. That is a deception of omission. The cold of the room seemed to intensify. The three scientists stood around the glass case, the silent child at the center of a modern tension between pursuit of knowledge and respect for the dead. The ethics were not abstract. They were embodied in this small, curled form. To the scientific mind, she was a repository of irreplaceable data, a keystone for understanding a vast, unexpected migration. To others, she was a distant relative, a soul whose rest should not be disturbed for a question about eye color. I have argued this with myself for months, Ivan said, his voice heavy. The Heritage Committee includes elders. They want to know who her people were, where they came from. They do not ask what color her eyes were. To them, that is irrelevant, almost disrespectful. It reduces her to a physical curiosity. Aris stared at the closed eyelids. He thought of the Spanish skull fragment, of the orbital rim that had started it all, that had been easy. Anonymous bone, no flesh, no humanity clinging to it. This was different. The connection was visceral. He imagined the child running on the steppe, the wind in her hair, looking out at the world through eyes that might have been an unprecedented shade in that time and place. His entire life's work had built to this moment, to testing his hypothesis against this perfectly preserved witness. The desire to know was a physical ache. But it is not irrelevant, he said, the words escaping almost against his will. It is a thread. If she carries it, it proves the gene travelled this far east, this early. It connects her, biologically, to people across Eurasia and beyond. It's not about reducing her. It's about placing her in the grand network of human movement. Her eye color, if we could know it, would be a sign of that connection. Ilara turned to him, her gaze sharp. That is our narrative, Aris. A beautiful, interconnected one. But is it the narrative that matters to her, or to the people who see her as an ancestor? We are extracting data to answer our questions, not theirs. We are writing her into our story of genetic diffusion. Is that ethical? When our story was not her story, the question hung in the frigid air. The hum of the refrigeration units was the only sound. Ivan watched them both, a mediator awaiting a verdict. Aris looked from Ilara's resolute face to the mummified child. His career had been built on the conviction that these hidden biological histories mattered, that they revealed profound truths about shared human heritage. But here, faced with the sacredness of individual remains, that conviction wavered. Was he, in his zeal, committing a kind of academic colonialism, mining this ancient body for a fact that served his model but meant nothing to the child in life or to her cultural descendants? The permit is for nuclear genomic analysis to determine origins and affiliations, Ivan repeated slowly, as if weighing each word. The mutation is part of the nuclear genome. If we analyze the genome, we will see it. We do not need to single it out as our target. We can seek the broader picture, and the mutation will be revealed within it, if it is there. The intent can be to answer the committee's questions. Our personal curiosity can be a secondary benefit, not the primary driver. It was a semantic dance, but it held a thread of integrity. They would not be lying. They would be fulfilling the permitted research aim. The discovery of marker X would be a byproduct, a piece of the larger anthropological puzzle. Ilara considered this, then gave a slight, reluctant nod. The ends do not justify the means, but if the means are ethically permitted for a broader purpose, and the ends are a truthful discovery within that data, we proceed with transparency about the methods and humility about the findings. Iris felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. It was a compromise, but one that allowed them to move forward without, he hoped, crossing a moral line. He looked back at the snow girl. Asterisk. I am sorry. Asterisk, he thought, a silent apology to the ancient child. Asterisk. We will be as careful as we can. Your story is more than a gene, but your gene may tell a story that connects you to a world you never knew. Ivan, seeing their unspoken agreement, moved to a cabinet and retrieved a sterile handheld drill with a fine diamond-tipped bit. The sound of its mechanism being checked was a harsh modern intrusion in the silent frozen vault. The delicate sampling would happen tomorrow, under full sterile protocol. As they left the cold chamber, shedding their protective gear, the image of the child remained seared behind Iris's eyes. The frozen child was no longer just a subject. She was a silent judge, and her DNA would soon deliver a verdict not only on his life's work, but on the ethics of the pursuit itself. The hook was set, not in data, but in the profound, uneasy humanity of the search. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 8. The Frozen Child. Part 2. Asterisk. Asterisk. The sampling was an act of surgical reverence. In the sterile anteroom, Ivan guided the fine diamond bit against the distal end of a small femur, its surface darkened and hard as petrified wood. The drill's whine was a high, thin protest in the quiet, a sound that felt profane. Aris watched, his gloved hands clenched at his sides, as a minute plume of ancient bone dust was captured in a sterile vial. The entire procedure took less than 30 seconds, leaving a pinprick scar on the millennia-old bone. Ivan sealed the vial, his movements deliberate and slow, as if to mitigate the violence of the act. The sample, a few milligrams of powder, held the potential to rewrite a narrative, but the process of obtaining it left a hollow feeling in Aris's chest, a scientist's guilt for the necessary trespass. The extraction and sequencing took a week, a period of suspended animation spent in Novosibirsk's bleak winter grip. Aris and Alara pored over archaeological reports on the Afanasyevo culture, an enigmatic pastoralist society whose material goods showed influences from both the western steppes and the indigenous cultures of the Altai. The child, they learned, was buried in a kurgan, a burial mound typical of steppe cultures far to the west. Her grave goods, the ceramic bowl, the bone pendant, were local in style, but the practice of mound burial spoke of distant origins. She was already a puzzle, a cultural hybrid frozen in time. When Ivan summoned them back to his office, his expression was unreadable. He gestured to 2 chairs before his monitor, which displayed a complex genomic browser. The full nuclear sequence of the Snow Girl was assembled, a 3 billion letter autobiography of a life cut short. The ancestry analysis first, Ivan said, his voice low. He brought up a principal component analysis plot, a scatter graph where genetic populations clustered like constellations. A single point, representing the child's genome, blinked in the center of the screen. It did not sit neatly within any one modern or ancient group. Instead, it occupied a space directly between 2 clusters, one labeled Western Steppe _ Ember, Early Middle Bronze Age, like the Yamnaya, and another labeled Ancient North Siberian. Admixture modeling bars below the graph quantified it, approximately 60% ancestry from Western steppe herders, 40% from indigenous Siberian hunter-gatherers. Ilara leaned forward, her eyes wide. She's a perfect 50-50 mix, a first-generation child of a truly long-distance union, or a representative of a recently admixed community. The steppe ancestry is the vector. Iris murmured, the pieces clicking. The Afanasyevo culture is thought to be an eastward migration of Yamnaya-related people. They brought their genes, their burial practices, their herds, and their hitchhikers. He pointed to the screen. Can we look at the OCA2 region? Ivan nodded, navigating the genome browser. The sequence for chromosome 15 scrolled by, a river of A's, T's, C's, and G's. He zoomed in on the precise coordinates of the OCA2 gene, the locus of a decade of obsession. The data was clean, the coverage deep, thanks to the permafrost preservation. There, at the exact nucleotide position, was the substitution, a cytosine where a thymine should have been. Marker X. The mutation was not just present, it was homozygous. The child had carried 2 copies. The room seemed to contract, the air thinning. The confirmation was absolute. The allele had not only travelled east, it had found its way into this high-altitude valley, into this specific child, and had been fully expressed. The preliminary scans hinting at light-sensitive orbital structure were vindicated. The Snow Girl, almost 4,000 years ago, in a world of dark-haired, dark-skinned pastoralists, had almost certainly possessed blue eyes. The epiphany struck Alrys not as a bolt of lightning, but as a slow, rising tide of understanding that washed away the last vestiges of a simplistic story. He stared at the data, the perfect genetic admixture, the homozygous mutation, and the model he and Elara had built, the clean westward narrative, shattered into something vastly more profound. The gene was not a marker of a people, not a tag for Europeanness or Nordic ancestry. It was a passive passenger, a bit of genetic flotsam that had been picked up by one migratory current, carried west to be amplified in bottlenecks and Viking ships, and picked up by another, carried east into the high steppes and frozen mountains, where it persisted in tiny isolated pools. It had survived not because it was important, but because it was irrelevant. It was neutral cargo on the complex, looping journeys of humanity. "It proves the vastness," he said, his voice hushed. "It's not a migration path, it's a migration web. The same source, splitting, going in opposite directions, carried by different groups who had different histories, different cultures, who mixed with entirely different peoples, and the gene just came along for the ride." He looked at Elara, then Ivan. This single point mutation connects a Bronze Age Altai child to a Mesolithic Spanish hunter, to a Neolithic farmer in Denmark, to a Viking in Iceland, not because they are the same people, but because the gene is a relentless tourist, indifferent to the cultural baggage of its hosts. Elara exhaled slowly, a plume of condensation in the cold office, the ultimate neutral trait. It doesn't care about language or technology or borders. It only cares about cell division and meiosis. Its history is a pure map of human movement and contact, stripped of all meaning except the fact of contact itself. Ivan smiled, a deep, satisfied expression that reached his eyes. "This is what I hoped you would see. Our Heritage Committee asks, who were her people? The genome says she was a bridge. Her very body was a meeting point of two great human expansions. And this," he tapped the screen where marker X glowed, "this is a tiny, shared heirloom from a distant relative, passed down through both lines, meeting in her. It is a symbol of connection, not of purity." That night, in his Spartan University guest apartment, Alrys could not sleep. The digital image of the homozygous genotype burned behind his eyelids. He saw the child not as a specimen, but as a nexus. Her blue eyes, a startling anomaly in the Altai Mountains 3 millennia ago, were a biological flag, marking an intersection of worlds. He thought of the endless, branching possibilities of descent, how her lineage might have died out, or how it might have contributed, this tiny Siberian thread, to the vast genetic tapestry of modern Eurasia. The gene's persistence here was a testament to the resilience of chance. He opened his laptop, the blank document glowing in the dark room. For years, his writing had been confined to grant proposals, technical papers, and defensive emails. Now, a different kind of urgency compelled him. The story was too big, too human to be left in graphs and academic jargon. It needed narrative. It needed to convey the awe he felt, the awe of a single minuscule chemical change echoing through time and space, linking faces across continents and millennia, through the blind, indifferent mechanics of inheritance. He began to type. The working title came easily. Asterisk, the first blue asterisk. He started not with the science, but with the image of the frozen child, curled in her sleep of ages. He described the cold room, the ethical tension, the moment of genomic truth. He wrote about the dark-skinned progenitor on the steppe, the long westward drift, the explosive spread with the Yamnaya, the Viking ships, and now the eastern journey, the proof from the permafrost. He wove in the personal stories from his bulletin board, the farmer, the Mumbai woman, the Chilean elder, showing the modern endpoints of these ancient tangled roots. The words flowed, a synthesis of data and wonder. He wrote about genetic drift, not as a dry statistical force, but as the quiet architect of human variation. He described natural selection as a harsh editor, and marker X as a phrase so innocuous it escaped every cut. The book, he realized, would not be an argument for the importance of the trait, but a demonstration of its profound unimportance. Its power lay in its neutrality, which made it a perfect tracer for the true story, the story of mixture, movement, and shared biological fortune. As dawn tinged the Siberian sky, a pale, frozen grey, Iris saved the document. He had found the true legacy of his discovery. It was not a headline, not a media sensation, not a tool for identity politics. It was a humbling reminder of our deep, accidental kinship. The frozen child, with her homozygous mutation, had given him the final piece, perspective. The journey of the first blue was a mirror held up to the entire human journey, random, contingent, beautiful in its interconnected complexity. And he, Aris Thorne, the disgraced footnote chaser, would now try to write it all down. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 9. The Backlash. Asterisk. The Siberian Confirmation, the perfect admixture of the frozen child, the elegant symmetry of the gene's east-west journey. These were the crowning achievements of Aris Thorne's career, the hard-won answers to a decade of obsessive questioning. He and Elara published their joint paper in a top-tier journal, presenting the data with rigorous, dispassionate clarity. The mutation was a neutral tracer, they argued. It spread a map of human mobility and chance, devoid of any selective meaning. The scientific community received it with respect, even admiration. It was a masterclass in paleogenomics. But the world outside the journals did not read for nuance. The backlash began in the dark corners of the internet, in forums where identity was armor and history a weapon. Screenshots of the paper's abstract, stripped of its careful context, were pasted alongside racist manifestos. Science proves blue eyes originated in superior steppe warriors, declared one headline on a fringe site. Another twisted the finding. Genetic study confirms Nordic trait is ancient, pure, and non-African. The fact that the progenitor was dark-skinned was ignored or dismissed as a lie. The fact that the gene had spread through drift and mixture was contorted into a narrative of conquest and racial destiny. Extremist groups, both white supremacist and, in a bizarre mirror, militant factions from other ethnicities, who saw the research as a Eurocentric theft of history, co-opted the findings. They were not interested in the story of a hitchhiking allele. They were interested in banners. Iris's inbox, which had once brimmed with heartfelt stories, now choked with venom. Hate mail arrived in vicious waves. From one side, he was a race traitor, a fraud trying to muddy pure lineages with talk of a Black Sea origin. "Keep your mud people theories to yourself," one email spat. From the other, he was a colonialist geneticist, erasing non-European histories by claiming a universal trait for his own kind. "Stop trying to own everything," another accused. He was called a liar, a propagandist, a fool. The personal attacks were bad enough, but the distortion of his life's work, the reduction of its beautiful, humbling complexity into crude tribal ammunition, felt like a physical violation. He stopped opening emails, left the phone off the hook, and sat in his lab in the basement, staring at the world map dotted with the journey of Marker X. Each glowing line of migration now felt like a target. Elara found him there one evening, the room dark save for the cold light of the monitor. She placed a cup of tea on his desk, the steam curling in the blue glow. "You cannot hide from this," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Silence is a vacuum, and they will fill it with their own story. You built this narrative. You must defend it. Defend it how?" Aris's voice was hollow. "They're not arguing science. They're creating myth. How do you fight a feeling with a fact? By stating the fact, loudly, clearly and repeatedly," she insisted. "Not in journals, on a stage. We hold a press conference. We do not debate their interpretation. We restate the science in plain terms. We emphasize the very points they ignore. The dark-skinned origin, the role of chance, the Siberian proof of mixture. We take the story back." The idea filled him with dread. The memory of the earlier media circus, the oversimplifications, the feeling of being a puppet in someone else's show, made him recoil, but the alternative, allowing his research to fester as fodder for hatred, was worse. With Vance's reluctant, PR-conscious approval, they scheduled a briefing at the university's main auditorium. The announcement alone drew a fresh storm, guaranteeing a packed room. The day arrived, grey and drizzling. The auditorium was a sea of faces and camera lenses. Iris felt a nausea that had nothing to do with stage fright. He saw a few familiar, hostile faces in the crowd, bloggers known for extremist views. He and Alara took their seats at a simple table on the stage, a large screen behind them. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A university press officer introduced them, and Alara took the lead. She displayed a simplified version of their migration map. "For months you have seen headlines about this research," she began, her Danish accent crisp and authoritative. "Many of those headlines have been wrong. Today we are not here to announce a new finding, but to correct the record on an old one." She pointed to the map. "This is not a map of the spread of a people. It is a map of the spread of a single, tiny change in the human genetic code, a change that first occurred, our models indicate, in a single individual who lived near the Black Sea approximately 10,000 years ago." She brought up a facial reconstruction of ancient individuals from that region and time, based on genetic phenotyping, all dark-skinned, dark-eyed. This individual, like all their contemporaries, had dark skin and dark eyes. The mutation, a simple copying error in a single gene, did not change that. It was a silent, recessive change. It did not make them better or worse. It did not help them survive. It was biologically neutral. The screen shifted to show the graph of genetic drift, the jagged line representing the allele's frequency wobbling wildly in small populations. For millennia, this mutation persisted purely by chance. It was carried by the descendants of that individual as they moved, mixed, and migrated. It was amplified in isolated populations, like those in ancient Scandinavia, not by selection, but by the random luck of the genetic draw. It was swept along in major population movements, like the Yamnaya expansions, not because it was advantageous, but because it was present in some of the migrants. It was dispersed by Viking voyages, and, as our recent work in Siberia proves conclusively, it also travelled east, mixing with entirely different populations. In every case it was a passenger, a hitchhiker. It was Aris's turn. He felt a calm settle over him, the calm of speaking a truth he knew down to his bones. He displayed the genomic data from the Altai child, the homozygous mutation highlighted. This child, who lived in the mountains of Siberia 3,800 years ago, carried this mutation. Her ancestry was a perfect blend of Western steppe herders and indigenous Siberian groups. She is proof that this gene is not a marker of any pure lineage. It is a marker of mixture, of human interconnection. Its presence in her shows it crossed cultural and geographic boundaries that we today imagine as fixed. They were not. He looked directly at the cameras, his gaze steady. The story of this mutation is not a story of superiority. It is the opposite. It is a story of shared random heritage. It is a demonstration that a trait some have used to divide humanity actually connects us across time and space in the most accidental way imaginable. One person had a random change. That change, through the blind forces of demography and chance, found its way into millions of people on multiple continents. Those people have vastly different histories, cultures, and identities. The only thing this trait signifies is that we are all subject to the same whims of genetics and time. The questions that followed were pointed, but Aris and Alara held the line, returning every time to the core message: chance, not hierarchy; mixture, not purity; a shared accident, not a divine gift. A reporter from a conservative outlet asked if the research undermined European identity. Alara replied, "It undermines the idea that identity can be based on a single ancient gene. Identity is culture, language, belief, things built by people, not coded in DNA. This gene's history shows our biological origins are always mixed, always complex. That doesn't undermine identity, it liberates it from false biological prisons." The press conference did not end the backlash. The hate mail continued, the forums seethed, but something else happened too. Major reputable news outlets ran follow-up stories with headlines like, The Humble, Accidental History of Blue Eyes. Science communicators made videos explaining genetic drift using the research as a prime example. The dominant narrative in the public sphere began, slowly, to shift from sensationalist cousins claims and extremist co-option to a more nuanced appreciation of the science. The story of shared random heritage started to take root. Aris, emotionally exhausted but clear-eyed, understood this was the new front line. The discovery was over. The interpretation was the forever war. His work was no longer just about ancient DNA. It was about combating the eternal human urge to twist biology into mythology. As he packed up his notes, he saw a young student waiting at the edge of the stage, her eyes a vivid, striking blue. She approached hesitantly. "Dr. Thorne," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you for saying it's an accident. I've always been told my eyes made me Irish or Nordic, but my family is from everywhere. It's just a thing. Hearing you call it random, it made it feel less like a box and more like a story. A really long, cool story." Iris managed a tired smile. "It is a long story," he agreed, "and you're a very recent chapter." She beamed and walked away. He watched her go, the vivid blue of her eyes a living testament to the ancient indifferent spark. The backlash would continue, but so would the truth. It was a story of chance, and for now, chance and a persistent, clear explanation seemed to be winning. The narrative was reclaimed, for the moment. It was enough. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 10. The Living Link. Asterisk. Asterisk. The backlash had receded, leaving behind a public landscape, both scarred and enlightened. The press conference had drawn a line in the sand, reclaiming the narrative of Marker X as one of chance and connection. But for Aris Thorne, the abstract battle of ideas needed grounding. The story lived in data and bones, but it thrived in people. To make the science indelible, it had to become personal, not just for him, but for anyone who wondered about the whisper of history in their own mirror. From this impulse, the Living Link Project was born. It was a global citizen science initiative, elegantly simple in design. For a nominal fee covering materials, anyone in the world could request a DNA kit, a cheek swab, and a return envelope. The kit would test for the presence of the derived OCA2 allele, Marker X. Participants would not receive a full ancestry breakdown. They would receive a single, profound data point, carrier, non-carrier, or if they possessed two copies, expressor. Along with the result, they would get a brief, beautifully illustrated booklet telling the 10,000-year journey of that allele, from the Black Sea steppe to the present, emphasizing its passage through countless lives and cultures. The project's motto, coined by Alara, was etched on every kit: "Not a test of who you are, a map of one thread that led to you." The response was a tidal wave of global curiosity. Kits shipped to over 100 countries. The project's servers hummed with incoming data, each submission a pinprick of light on a world map in Aris's lab, a modern constellation mirroring the ancient migration routes. But numbers were not stories. To put a human face on the data, the project organized a series of small, intimate gatherings in major cities, inviting participants to share their results and their personal histories. The first was held in a sunlit community hall in London, its walls lined with the project's iconic map. Aris, feeling more like a host than a scientist, waited nervously as the attendees filtered in. The Living Link Project had done more than collect data. It had returned the science to the human scale. It demonstrated that the same genetic thread could mean utterly different things in different lives. A curiosity, a norm, a bittersweet legacy. Yet beneath those personal meanings, the thread itself remained constant, a silent biological cord connecting them all to a single accidental moment on a distant steppe. Aris realized this was the ultimate defense against the backlash, against co-option and simplification. The story was too vast, too nuanced, and now too personally owned by thousands of people around the world, to be hijacked by any single hateful narrative. The living links were the proof. They were the final, unassailable chapter. The gene's journey was over. Its meaning, in the eyes of its bearers, had just begun. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 11. The mechanism revealed. Asterisk. Asterisk. The world map in Aris's lab glowed with the soft, persistent light of the Living Link Project, a a constellation of human stories. Yet, for all the profound connections traced across millennia and continents, a fundamental question had remained in the realm of elegant inference: the precise cellular asterisk how asterisk. They knew the mutation's address in the genetic code and its staggering journey through history. They could predict its phenotypic outcome with statistical certainty, but the actual physical mechanism, the moment the abstract code became visible color, had been a black box in their narrative, described but never directly witnessed. That final veil was about to be lifted, not in a dusty archaeology lab, but in a state-of-the-art tissue engineering facility across campus. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Lena Chen, a former colleague from Aris's early days in developmental genetics. She had read his book, Asterisk the First Blue, Asterisk, and been captivated not by the grand migrations, but by the biological simplicity at its heart. Lena's specialty was synthetic tissue models, growing miniature functional organs from stem cells to study disease. She saw in Iris's ancient mutation a perfect, clean test case, a single genetic change with a dramatic, visible outcome. She proposed a collaboration to build the world's first synthetic human iris, and to watch in real time as Marker X performed its ancient trick. Aris and Ilara entered Lena's lab, a stark contrast to their own domains of ancient bone and genomic data. Here, everything was pristine white and gleaming steel, humming with the quiet pulse of bioreactors and incubators. The air smelled of disinfectant and growth medium. Lena, a woman with a brisk, energetic manner and eyes alight with focused curiosity, greeted them at a large, sterile hood. Inside, on a glass slide, lay the fruit of months of work, a disc of tissue about the size of a pencil eraser, floating in a bath of pink nutrient fluid. "This is it," Lena said, her voice muffled slightly by her mask. "A fully differentiated iris tissue model, generated from induced pluripotent stem cells. It has all the key cell types, the stromal fibroblasts, the epithelial layers, and most importantly, functional melanocytes." She pointed with a gloved finger. The tissue was a uniform, translucent pale pink, like a sliver of undercooked shrimp. In its default state, with the standard human OCA2 gene, the melanocytes will produce and deposit melanin granules into the iris stroma over the next 48 hours. It will turn a dark brown. That's the baseline. She then gestured to a second, identical tissue disc in a neighboring chamber. "This one is genetically identical, except we've used CRISPR to introduce your mutation. The exact nucleotide substitution, A to C, at that precise locus on chromosome 15. It's the ancient typo, recreated in modern stem cells." The simplicity of the setup was breathtaking. 10,000 years of history, millions of carriers, centuries of scientific deduction, all reduced to two tiny blobs of lab-grown tissue under glass. Aris felt a familiar, almost reverent tension. This was the experiment he could never have dreamed of conducting, a direct test on the very machinery of color. "We're initiating melanogenesis now," Lena said, injecting a precise cocktail of hormones and signaling molecules into each chamber. "Watch the control." On a high-resolution monitor linked to a microscopic camera, they observed the first tissue disc. The melanocytes, star-shaped cells embedded in the stroma, stirred into activity. Tiny dark granules, melanin, began to appear within their cellular bodies like grains of black sand. Then, through intricate cellular processes, the granules were transported and deposited into the surrounding iris tissue. It was a slow, deliberate painting. The translucent pink stroma began to cloud, then darken, turning a milky grey, then a sepia, and finally, over the course of an hour, a deep, rich chocolate brown. The process was mesmerizing in its organic inevitability. This was how brown eyes were made. In every human fetus, a foundational biological act. Lena switched the monitor feed to the second chamber, the tissue carrying the ancient mutation. The same hormonal trigger was applied. The melanocytes activated. The black granules of melanin began to form within them. But then, the process faltered. The transport mechanisms, regulated by the subtly altered OCA2 protein, became inefficient. The granules accumulated inside the melanocytes, piling up like clogged cargo, but only a trickle was successfully exported into the stroma. The tissue remained stubbornly pale. A faint, dusty sprinkling of pigment occurred, but it was sparse, uneven. The iris did not turn brown. It stayed a translucent pinkish grey. Lena adjusted the microscope's lighting, switching to a side scatter configuration that mimicked how light enters the eye. The change was instantaneous and magical. The control tissue, now dark brown, absorbed the light, appearing opaque and deep. But the mutant tissue, with its sparse melanin, became a different universe. The light penetrated the translucent stroma and struck the network of collagen fibers, the intricate mesh-like scaffolding of the iris. These fibers scattered the light, a physical phenomenon called Rayleigh scattering, which favors shorter wavelengths. The tissue, under the microscope's beam, glowed with a soft ethereal blue. It was not a pigment, it was a trick of physics, a subtraction. The mutation did not create a blue substance, it simply failed to create enough of a brown one. By limiting the melanin curtain, it unveiled the underlying structural canvas, which then interacted with light to produce the color. The mechanism was devastatingly simple, elegant, and passive. The gene didn't do anything active to make blue, it just did less to make brown. Iris stared, utterly transfixed. He had seen countless visualizations, simulations, and artistic renderings. He had read the biophysics papers, but this was different. This was the act itself, separated from a living person, isolated in its pure causal form. The single nucleotide substitution, that ancient typo, was right there, in that chamber, manifesting as a lac. Its entire monumental history, the survival on the steppe, the bottleneck, the Yamnaya tide, the Viking ships, the frozen child in Siberia, the millions of living carriers, all of it flowed from this tiny mechanistic failure. A broken step in a pigment production pathway had echoed through time to paint continents with chance and light. Ilara let out a soft sigh beside him. "So that's all it is," she whispered. "A traffic jam inside a cell, a clogged pipe." Lena nodded, a smile in her eyes. "A loss-of-function mutation. One of the cleanest examples I've ever seen. It doesn't kill the cell. It doesn't cause disease. It just slightly reduces the throughput of one type of pigment to one part of the body. It's the definition of a neutral mutation, biologically trivial, visually dramatic." Aris finally found his voice, and we just watched it happen. The words felt inadequate. He had spent years thinking in epochs and populations, in statistical waves and migratory currents. Now, he was confronted with the exquisite, miniature reality of it. The grandeur of the story was built upon a microscopic flaw. The vast interconnected human narrative of blue eyes rested on a single, subcellular shipping error. He thought of the first individual, the dark-eyed child of the simulation. That same cellular process had unfolded in their developing eyes in utero, 10,000 years ago, but without the mutation, the melanin curtain had descended fully. In one of their gametes, the typo had occurred. In a descendant millennia later, when two such typos met, this exact scene had played out in a womb, the melanocytes failing their deposit, the stroma scattering light. That child had opened their eyes to a world that had never seen that particular shade before. All the subsequent history, the curiosity, the reverence, the bigotry, the pride, the sense of connection, all of it was a cultural and social reaction to this tiny, silent biophysical event. The awe that washed over him was humbling and immense. It was the awe of scale, of how something so small could become so vast through the indifferent amplifiers of time and reproduction. Science had explained the mechanism, stripping it of mystery, yet in doing so had revealed a deeper wonder, the power of insignificance. The mutation wasn't a brilliant innovation, it was a barely noticeable breakdown, and that breakdown, through the blind, churning lottery of heredity, had become a thread in the tapestry of humankind. Lena carefully preserved the tissue samples, the blue glowing one destined for further study. As they left the lab, the sterile brightness giving way to the muted twilight of the university corridor, Iris felt unmoored. The final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place with such quiet, undeniable clarity. The story was complete, from the quantum misstep in a steppe dweller's dividing cell to the precise scattering of light in a petri dish. He had traced the echo from its source to its physical manifestation. Standing at a window overlooking the darkening campus, he reflected on the journey. The mechanism was revealed, simple and elegant. It demanded no deities, no superior destinies, no racial essences. It required only a copying error, the laws of physics, and the relentless branching river of time. The blue that had captivated and divided humanity was, in the end, just light playing in the empty spaces where a little less brown pigment had been laid down. A world of meaning, built on a microscopic absence. The ore lingered, a quiet companion to the hard-won truth. The first blue was not a creation, it was an accident, patiently waiting through 100 centuries for its moment in the light. Asterisk, asterisk, Chapter 12, The Legacy, Part 1, asterisk, asterisk. The book arrived on a Tuesday, a heavy box of author copies that smelled of fresh ink and binding glue. Aris Thorne lifted one out, its cover cool and smooth beneath his fingers. Asterisk. The First Blue, An Accidental History of Humanity, asterisk. The title was embossed in a deep oceanic blue against a field of stark white. He opened it to a random page, the text a river of black type, telling a story that had consumed a decade of his life. A story that began with a bone fragment in a basement, and now sprawled across continents and millennia. Holding the physical object felt surreal, like cradling his own ghost. The journey from disgraced geneticist to published author was one he had never charted. The publication was not a quiet academic affair. The publisher, sensing the public's lingering fascination, had orchestrated a tour. Aris, who had once fled from media scrums, now found himself propelled through airport lounges and into green rooms, a reluctant ambassador for deep time. He spoke at bookstores filled with curious readers, at science festivals under vast tents, and in university auditoriums that echoed with the weight of his words. His message, refined through fire and backlash, was one of profound humility. In a packed hall in Berlin, standing before a screen that displayed the now iconic migration map, the web of lines stretching from the Black Sea to Scandinavia to the Altai Mountains, he found his rhythm. The nervousness that had once gripped him was gone, replaced by a calm, steady certainty. "We are taught to think of evolution as a story of improvement," he began, his voice amplified in the hushed space. "Of better tools, stronger bodies, smarter brains. We imagine our traits as medals won in a brutal competition. But the history of this one trait, the story I've called asterisk the First Blue asterisk, teaches us the opposite. It is a story of insignificance elevated by chance." He clicked to an image of the synthetic iris tissue from Lena Chen's lab, the side scatter light making it glow cerulean. This is the mechanism, a single minuscule error in a gene that slightly reduces a pigment deposit. It does nothing for survival. It does not help you see better in the fog or the snow. It is biologically trivial. For thousands of years it was a secret, carried in the blood of people who lived, loved and died, utterly unaware of the silent passenger within them. The narrative unfolded as he spoke, the dark-skinned progenitor on the steppe, the gene's survival through the blind lottery of genetic drift, its capture in the Baltic bottleneck, its ride on the Yamnaya tide, its dispersal by Viking ships, its surprising presence in a frozen Siberian child. He emphasized the key points, the bulwarks against misinterpretation. This gene's path crosses every modern boundary we hold sacred, national, ethnic, racial. It was in Europe, yes, but it was also in Siberia. It spread not because it was better, but because it was not bad enough to be weeded out. It is a perfect tracer of human movement, precisely because it meant nothing. It is a mirror, showing us that our biological history is one of mixture, migration and magnificent random accident. During the Q&A, a young man with intense eyes asked the question Aris had learned to expect, but doesn't tracing a trait back to one person, even if it's just for eye colour, risk creating new myths, new stories of a special lineage? Aris nodded. It is the greatest danger. That is why the full story is so important. The origin is a single person, but the dissemination is a story of everyone else. That person's descendants mixed with farmers, who mixed with herders, who mixed with hunters from other lands. The gene passed into countless lineages. To claim this trait as the property of one people is to ignore the entire messy, beautiful history of its journey. It is to take a snapshot of its current frequency and mistake it for an eternal truth. The history debunks the very categories it might seem to enforce. There is no blue-eyed race. There are only people, connected by a thread of chance so thin it's a miracle it exists at all. The tour's final stop, arranged privately, was not a lecture hall, but a place of silence and stone. He returned to northern Spain, to the Cantabrian coast where it had all begun. The cave system, now a protected archaeological site, was closed to the public, but special permission had been granted. The lead archaeologist, a woman named Sophia, who had excavated the skull fragment years ago, met him at the entrance. She remembered the quiet, obsessive geneticist who had requested the sample, the one her colleagues had dismissed. "You were right," she said simply, shaking his hand, "about the pigment. Not that I doubted the science, but it's one thing to see a data point, another to read the story it told." Together, they entered the cave. The modern lighting system cast a soft artificial glow over the ancient walls, revealing faint red ochre hand stencils, the signatures of the Mesolithic people who had sheltered here. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and time. Sophia led him to a recess, a niche in the limestone where the fragment labelled CS-117 had been found. The spot was empty now, marked only by a small discreet tag. "He or she was buried here," Sophia said softly, her voice echoing slightly. "A single individual, placed in a fetal position. The fragment you had was from the back of the skull. The rest we have pieces. It was a deliberate burial. Someone cared for them." Aris stood in the silence, the hum of the tour buses and the modern world completely absent. He placed his hand on the cool rock of the niche, not as a scientist, but as a pilgrim. This was where the body had lain, the body that had carried the skull, that had held the bone, that had contained the DNA, that had harboured Marker X. A direct physical link. The individual from his simulation, from his models, from the first chapter of his book, had lived here, died here. They had looked out from this cave mouth at a world without agriculture, without metals, without nations. They had seen the same sea, now changed beyond measure, and the same stars. A profound connection settled over him, a sense of timescale that was almost vertiginous. 7,000 years separated his hand on this rock from the hand that had placed the body here. Yet, through the unbroken chain of cell division and reproduction, a piece of that individual's genetic code, that one tiny mutated piece, had survived. It had passed through countless unknown lives, through famines and migrations, through love and loss, to eventually find its way into his sequencer, and from there, into the irises of millions of living people around the globe. The distance collapsed. The deep past was not a foreign country. It was a relative's house, and he was standing in its doorway. He thought of the frozen child in Siberia, of the Viking in the Danish Museum, of Kofi Mensah in London, of Mrs. Tanaka in Japan. All of them, and himself, were leaves on a single, impossibly vast and branching tree, its seed planted by a random genetic event in a person who had breathed this very air. The humility he preached in lectures was no longer an intellectual position. It was a visceral, felt truth. He was insignificant, a momentary flicker, and yet he was connected, by the thinnest of biological threads, to a deep and shared past. Sophia left him alone for a few minutes. In the quiet, Iris closed his eyes. He imagined the burial, the grief or reverence of those who had placed their companion here. He imagined the long dark silence that followed, centuries piling up like sediment. Then the archaeologists, the careful brushes, the catalogue number, then his own desperate late-night extraction, the spark of blue light on his screen, the years of struggle, collaboration, discovery, and defense. It was a single continuum, a story of curiosity reaching back to touch its own origins. He opened his eyes and looked at the hand stencils on the wall, the red ochre prints that said, "Asterisk, I was here. Asterisk." His own work was a different kind of handprint, a genetic one, but the impulse felt the same, a need to understand, to connect, to leave a mark that said, "Asterisk, I saw this." This mattered. Leaving the cave, blinking in the bright Spanish sun, He felt a chapter closing, not with a bang, but with a deep, resonant quiet. The legacy of Asterisk. The first blue asterisk was not in the book sales or the lecture fees. It was in this feeling, the dismantling of arrogance, the fostering of a connection that transcended the shallow categories of the present. The story was out in the world now, a vessel carrying its humble message. We are all accidents of history, bound together by threads of chance so delicate we rarely see them until we look, very carefully, into the deep, reflecting pools of the past. Asterisk. Asterisk. Chapter 12. The Legacy. Part 2. Asterisk. Asterisk. 5 years had softened the edges of the frenzy, sanding the controversy down to a settled, respected fact in the public consciousness. The story of the first blue was now a staple of high school biology, a classic case study in genetic drift and neutral evolution. Dr. Aris Thorne, once the disgraced footnote chaser, now held a named chair in integrated anthropogenetics at a small progressive university. His office was no longer a basement bunker but a sunlit corner room overlooking a quad where students lounged under ancient oaks. Bookshelves held his own work alongside dog-eared classics, and on the wall the world map from the Living Link project glowed softly, its constellation of dots now static, the project archived, its mission complete. His undergraduate seminar, Genes as Storytellers, was always oversubscribed. Today, he stood before a room of 20 expectant faces, the morning light streaming in. He did not begin with the double helix. He began with a single, grainy photograph projected on the screen, the frozen child from the Altai, curled in her eternal sleep. This individual died approximately 3,800 years ago, Aris said, his voice calm, practiced. Her people buried her with care in a mountain permafrost. For millennia, she was a secret kept by the ice. Then a decade ago, a geneticist, a rather stubborn one, extracted a minute sample from her femur. He clicked to the next slide, the homozygous genotype for marker X, highlighted in blue, and we found that she carried a specific mutation, in 2 copies, a mutation that first occurred in a single person roughly 6,000 years before her birth, thousands of kilometers to the west. Through the blind mechanisms of migration and mixture, that mutation found its way into her high mountain valley. It connected her biologically to people she never knew and places she never saw. He saw the students lean in, the familiar spark of connection igniting in their eyes. This was why he taught, not to impart data, but to impart scale, the humble, breathtaking scale of human inheritance. He walked them through the journey, not as a dry list of migrations, but as a series of improbable survivals, the mutation evading extinction in a small hunter-gatherer band, catching a ride on the westward tide of farmers, being amplified in the Baltic isolation, swept eastward by steppe pastoralists, and later fanned out across oceans by Norse sails. He emphasized the why that had become his mantra, not selection but chance, not destiny but accident, not purity but mixture. This trait, he said, gesturing to his own brown eyes, a deliberate contrast, did not make anyone fitter. It did not help them run faster, think clearer, or love better. It was a passenger, and because it was a passenger, its distribution today is a perfect neutral map of human movement and contact over the last 10,000 years. It shows us that our histories are inextricably woven together, long before passports or borders existed. After class, a few students lingered with questions. One young woman, her own eyes a vivid green, asked about the ethical dimensions of ancient DNA research. Aris spoke of the Altai child, of the need for reverence and collaboration with descendant communities. As the last student filed out, he settled at his desk, the quiet of the office a comfortable blanket. He checked his email, sifting through departmental announcements and journal alerts. One subject line caught his eye. "Thank you from a 7th grader in Toronto." He opened it. The message was simple, typed with careful earnestness. Asterisk. Dear Dr. Thorne, my name is Chloe. I am 12. I have blue eyes. For a school project, we had to research a genetic trait, and I found your book in the library. I always knew my eyes came from my grandma, who was from Scotland, but your book made me think about before her. It made me think about the first person who had this, and all the people in between. It made me feel like I am part of a really, really long story. Like my eyes are a tiny piece of history looking out at the world. I used to think genetics was just about diseases and Punnett squares. Now I think it's about time travel. Thank you for making me feel connected. Sincerely, Chloe. Aris read it twice, a warm, quiet satisfaction spreading through him. This was the legacy that mattered. Not the publications, not the lectures, but this, a child on another continent seeing her own reflection as a page in a vast ancient book. She understood. The connection was not a bloodline to be claimed, but a story to be acknowledged, a random gift from the deep past. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the glowing world map on the wall. The dots were motionless now, a frozen galaxy of human carriers. Each point represented a story of surprise, of ordinary inheritance, of personal history intersecting with deep time. Together, they formed a web, delicate and resilient, linking the Pontic Steppe to Toronto, the Altai Mountains to Mumbai, Neolithic villages to modern metropolises. It was a map of shared ancestry for one tiny trait, a visual proof of the invisible threads that bind the human family through the mere passage of genes from parents to children across millennia. The afternoon sun slanted across the room, painting a bright rectangle on the polished floor. In its path, dust motes danced, like tiny stars in a miniature cosmos. Aris stood and walked to the small mirror mounted beside the door, a functional thing for straightening a tie before lectures. He looked at his own reflection, at the face that had aged over this long journey, the grey now dominant in his hair, the lines etched deeper around his eyes, and he looked at his eyes themselves. They were, as they had always been, a warm, unremarkable brown, the common dominant hue of our species. A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, reaching his eyes, crinkling the corners. The irony was perfect, and he cherished it. He, Aris Thorne, who had devoted his professional life to tracing the history of a trait he did not possess, had become the conduit for its story. His brown eyes had read the data, presented the findings, written the book, and taught the students. They had gazed upon the blue eyes of the frozen child in a Siberian lab and seen a connection that transcended phenotype. His work had linked millions of people to one ancient accidental moment of change, yet he himself remained outside that particular circle of inheritance. He was not a descendant of that first blue-eyed person. He was a chronicler of their descendants,